Shavua Tov Rabotai, we're continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Kilayim. We're up to Perek Bet Mishnah Tet. The Mishnah says, "Harotze la'asot sadeu karachat mikol min." If a person wants to make his field into many squares, all of different species, literally, karachat means a bare patch, meaning an empty patch that you prepared for planting but didn't plant anything yet. If a person wants to make these patches in order to plant different species, he can make 24 squares to every bet se'ah of land. Mikarachat lebet rova, each square measuring a bet rova, v'zoreh betucha kol min sheyirtzeh, and he can plant now whatever kind of species he wants in each square. And Mepharshim explain a bet se'ah is about 2,500 square amot. Now, since there are 24 rovas, which is a quarter kav in a se'ah, like we learned in the beginning of Mishnah Aleph, a bet rova is 1/24 of a bet se'ah. That's about 104 square amot, which if you make into a square is about 10.2 amot on each side. That is how the Rambam learns it. The Rav gives a square measuring as 10 amot by 10 amot and 2.5 tfachim, about 10.4. That's close enough of a square to a square to be a karachat. Now the Mishnah said, "V'zoreh betucha kol min sheyirtzeh." You can plant whatever kind of species you want in each square. And the Mepharshim explain, squares of this size appear to be separate from each other and they're not mixed. They're therefore not considered kilayim. Since a bet se'ah has 24 bet rovas, the maximum amount of species a person can plant in a bet se'ah is 24. Now, even though this means that different species are going to be planted right next to each other with no separation, this Tana, who is Rabbi Meir, like we'll see later on, he holds that because of the square shape and their bet rova size, they're considered separate and distinct from one another, and they do not appear to be mixed. Therefore, there is no issue of kilayim. The Mishnah says, "Aita karachat achat o shtaim." If there were one or two unplanted squares in a field of grain, zoram chardal, you are allowed to plant them with mustard. Shalosh, however, if there are three unplanted squares, lo yizrem chardal, in that case you may not plant them with mustard, mipnei shiniret b'kistei chardal, because now it looks like a field of mustard. Divrei Rabbi Meir, these are the words of Rabbi Meir. And then Mepharshim explain that when you have three or more bet rovas of mustard that are planted in the field of grain, it looks like you have a field of mustard growing inside a field of grain. Why? Because mustard is normally planted in small patches. Therefore, according to Rabbi Meir, 3 bet rovas is considered a large enough amount to look like a field of mustard. Like we learned earlier in the previous Mishnah, you are not allowed to plant a field of mustard next to a field of grain. Now the Mepharshim explain, to plant 3 bet rovas of any other kind of crop near a field of wheat is mutar. That's not problematic. Why? Because other crops are usually planted over larger areas. So 3 bet rovas of them do not look like a field. So according to Rabbi Meir, you have a special leniency for a bet rova planted in the shape of a square because it's too small to look like a field, and yet it's large enough and distinct enough not to look like individual plants growing in a field of something else. But the sages say, Tesha karachot mutarot, 9 squares are permitted in a bet se'ah, 10 asurot, but 10 squares are asur. And the Mepharshim explain that in the view of the Chachamim, squares that have different species are not allowed to be planted right next to each other, but they have to be separated by other empty squares. That means if you work out the math, the Mepharshim point out, that would only allow 9 squares to be planted in every bet se'ah. And the Mepharshim go into depth to explain the math of the Chachamim. They have to be separated by a bet rova of unplanted land. If grain is involved, we'll see the next Mishnah. So only 9 bet rova squares can be planted in a bet se'ah. And then the Mepharshim point out, you can't even really fit 9 planted squares in a bet se'ah. All the empty squares also have to be a full bet rova, 10.2 times 10.2. Therefore, it comes out the Chachamim were lenient and they allowed the empty land between the planted squares to be slightly less than a betrova. Instead of 10.2, 9.7, in order to make it possible to plant 9 betrovas in a square bet se'ah. And the Mishnah concludes, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says, Afilu chol sadeh bet kur. Even if a person's entire field is the size of a bet kur, 30 bet se'az, lo ya'aseh betochah chutz mikarach echat, he may not make in it more than one square of a different species. And the Mefarshim explain, if you look at the Rav, very interesting, he says, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov is much more stricter than the Chachamim. Chachamim allowed 9 different squares of different species. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says, you cannot do more than one. And the Rav points out that even in a field as large as a bet kul, according to Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov, meaning even if it's 30 bet se'ah, you cannot plant more than a single square of a different crop. And the Rav says that we do not know the reason for this ruling. He writes, V'tama de Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov lo itparesh. We do not know the logic behind the halacha stated by Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. That is in Rabotai of Mishnah Tet. Mishnah Yud now is going to discuss, we just learned that a separation of a bet rova you need to have between 2 squares. A bet rova is 10.2 times 10.2 amot. Now the Mishnah is going to teach us what can be included in this bet rova. Kol shu betoch bet rova, anything that's within a bet rova, ole b'midat bet rova, that counts towards the measure of a bet rova. And the Mefarshim explain, the Rav gives examples. For example, you have cracks in the ground that are filled with water, right? So these are considered a natural part of the field. As long as they are less than 10 tvachim deep, they count towards the measure of a bet rova, even though they are not fit to plant. Achilat gefen, the work area around the grapevine, which the Mefarshim explain, an area of 6 tvachim, which is between 18 to 24 inches, is eaten by the vine, meaning it is needed surrounding a grapevine to work. That's included part of the betrova, va'kever, and a grave, va'asela, and a rock, ulin b'midat berova, they all count towards the measure of a betrova. And the Mefarshim explain, even though the work area around a vineyard, you cannot plant with other species, we're going to see later on, the Tana of our Mishnah holds that the work area around a single grapevine is mutar for planting. Now, since it is mutar to plant in this area, if you leave it empty, you show that you do not want to mix different species, and therefore it counts towards the betrova to separate between 2 crops. Now, even though we know it is forbidden to benefit from a grave, if you look at Gemara Sanhedrin, page 48a, you're not allowed to benefit from a grave, and therefore you shouldn't be allowed to grow a crop in it. Nevertheless, the Chachamim say a grave counts towards the betrova. Why? Because people look at the field, they do not see a grave, and they do not realize that it is asur to plant there. Therefore, it looks like an area that is being left unplanted as a separation. And finally, the Mefarshim explain, when we say a rock here, we're talking about one that's not 10 tefachim high. If it were 10 tefachim high, it would be considered a wall, and that would be a separation on its own. Now, rocks this low, lower than 10 tefachim, are considered natural parts of the field. Therefore, they count even though they cannot be planted. Now, the Mishnah continues, Tivua b'tivua, if someone wants to plant one kind of grain in a field of another kind of grain, betrova, you have to separate it from what is already grown by a betrova. And the Mefarshim explain, if you want to plant barley in a field of wheat, you have to leave a betrova of unplanted land on all the sides. Also, you have to begin planting the barley from the edge of the field, so that the barley should not be completely surrounded by wheat. And the Mishnah continues, Yarak biyarak, if you want to plant vegetables of one kind in a field of vegetables of another kind, shat tvachim, you need 6 tvachim of separation between them. And the Mefarshim point out that the width of the 6 tvachim has to be maintained for a length of 6 tvachim. After that, it can narrow and converge at an angle towards the rest of the field, provided again it's 6 tvachim wide, and it's maintained for a length of 6 tvachim. Tivua beyarak, yarak b'tivua, if he plants grain in a field of vegetables, or vegetables in a field of grain, betrova, you need a betrova between them. Now the Mefarshim point out, this is only by a row that is a square. If the row is the shape of a rectangle, meaning longer than it's wide, a separation of 6 tvachim is enough. We're going to learn about this more later on in Perek Gimel. And the Mishnah concludes, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Rabbi Eliezer says, Yarak bitvuah, for vegetables in a field of grain, shishat tvachim, 6 tvachim are enough, because Rabbi Eliezer treats vegetables next to grain according to the more lenient view of vegetables, where the Tanna Kama rules, he treats them in the more stringent view like grain. That is the end of today's Mishnah. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen v'Amen.